Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This video is about Rene Descartes' Meditations I and II. So it's Meditations on First Philosophy, and these are the first two books that we'll be going over. So I'm just going to start reading here at the beginning on page 265 to give you an idea of what he's trying to do here. He says, several years have now elapsed since I first became aware that I had accepted, even from my youth, many false opinions for true, and that consequently what I have afterwards based on such principles was highly doubtful. And from that time I was convinced of the necessity of undertaking once in my life to rid myself of all the opinions I had adopted, and of commencing anew the work of building from the foundation, if I desire to establish a firm and abiding superstructure in the sciences. So he's saying, I had to wait until I was secure in my retirement, and thought that waiting any longer wouldn't help me realize anything new in life. So he says, today then, at the bottom of 265, since I have opportunely freed my mind from all cares, and am happily disturbed by no passions, and since I am in the secure possession of leisure and a peaceable retirement, I will at length apply myself earnestly and freely to the general overthrow of all my former opinions. So he's going to now doubt, he says, everything he formerly believed, so that he can start from scratch on a firm foundation and build what he calls a superstructure for the sciences. How should we go about the task of understanding ourselves and understanding the material world, if there even is a material world, which he's going to come to doubt. As he said, he's going to doubt every single possible thing that he can doubt. I'm going to read this quote where he writes about Archimedes. And I thought I knew exactly where it was. So, okay, here it is on page 269. In the middle paragraph, in the last full sentence, he says, Archimedes, that he might transport the entire globe from the place it occupied to another, demanded only a point that was firm and immovable. So also I shall be entitled to entertain the highest expectations if I am fortunate enough to discover only one thing that is certain and indubitable. So what is, if there's even one truth that cannot be doubted, he says, upon that one truth he can build a superstructure for the sciences. And in large part he did help with that endeavor by providing for example, the Cartesian grid in geometry, and his claim that we should look at the material world as objects extended in space that can be measured mathematically. So that was really helped to get modern science going. But in this essay, he's going to doubt even the existence of physical objects that we see, even the existence of space itself. And he'll come to the final conclusion. His one indubitable, undoubtable truth is that he exists as a thinking thing. And his argument is simply, even if I doubt everything else that exists, I can't doubt the fact that I'm doubting. So to doubt is to think. So, and he's famous for the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Well, to doubt is the same as to think. So to doubt is to exist. So if you look at the bottom of page 269, doubtless then I exist since I am deceived. And there he's talking about his thought experiment of a malignant demon that is forcing him to perceive a world that's just entirely a fantasy. So let's get to that argument on page 266. He says that he doubts everything that he could see with his senses because his sense perceptions have deceived him in the past. So it would not be prudent to put absolute confidence in that by which we have even once been deceived. So you can't trust your senses as an infallible source of knowledge, because we've all been deceived by our senses. You think you see something it turns out to be something else. I had a friend tell me a story about it. He spent some time terrified of what he perceived to be a rabid fox at dusk on a construction site, but it turned out to be a plastic bag whipping around in the wind. So if you've been fooled by your senses once, maybe you're constantly fooled by your senses. And then he says, well, only a lunatic would think, looking at their body and the world around them, that it's not real. And he says, yeah, that's true. However, and the last full paragraph on page 266, he says, though this be true, I must nevertheless here consider that I am a man, and that consequently I am in the habit of sleeping and representing to myself in dreams those same things, or even sometimes others less probable, which the insane think are presented to them in their waking moments. And then he says, how many times have I dreamt that here I am sitting by the fire, fully clothed, then I wake up and I'm not dressed and I'm in my bed. So this entire world that you take to be so real that you can touch and pinch yourself, oh, if I'm dreaming, this will wake me up. He's saying, well, you can't be sure of that. You could still be dreaming. And then he says, if you think about it deeply enough as he's doing, then in amazement I almost persuade myself that I am now dreaming. So he goes on to say at the bottom of page 266, let us suppose then that we are dreaming, and that all these particulars, namely the opening of the eyes, the motion of the head, everything else, are merely illusions, painted representations which could not have been found. Okay, so then he's saying, all right, well, even if we're dreaming, that implies the existence of a world similar to the one we're dreaming. Just like in dreams, our fantasy world in dreams resembles this waking world. So, but then Descartes will say, well, not necessarily. Maybe the all-powerful God who created everything is just making us perceive these things, which don't really exist outside of the fantasy that God has created. Okay, but you say God is supremely good and would not deceive us. Then at the bottom of page 267, he says, if, however, it were repugnant to the goodness of deity to have created me subject to constant deception, it would seem likewise to be contrary to his goodness to allow me to be occasionally deceived, and yet it is clear that this is permitted. But then he'll go on to say, okay, let's not say that it's God who is deceiving us constantly for the sake of doubting everything. On page 268, the last full paragraph, he says, I will suppose then not that deity who is sovereignly good and the fountain of truth, but that some malignant demon who is at once exceedingly potent and deceitful has employed all his artifice to deceive me. I will suppose that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, figures, sounds, and all external things are nothing better than the illusions of dreams, by means of which this being has laid snares for my credulity. So then he says, okay, that's what I'm going to think. No matter what I perceive, I can assume it's the fiction of my mind created by this malignant demon. So he goes on to say, finally, that at the very bottom of page 269, the last couple of sentences, he says, far from it, I assuredly existed since I was persuaded. But there is, I know not what being, who is possessed at once of the highest powers and the deepest cunning, who is constantly employing all his ingenuity in deceiving me. Doubtless then I exist, since I am deceived, and let him deceive me as many as he may, he can never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall be conscious that I am something. So that it must, in fine, be maintained, all things being maturely and carefully considered, that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true each time it is expressed by me or conceived in my mind. So there's his argument. Even if this malignant demon fooled him into thinking that he was seeing a real world, even fooled him into thinking the laws of mathematics were true, he can't fool him out of the realization that he's being fooled. And if you're being fooled, you must exist in order to receive the deception. So that's the one indubitable truth upon which he then wants to build the superstructure for the sciences. So starting with the one subjective point of consciousness, just a thinking thing, that's all he can prove that he really is. He can't prove that the material body or anything outside of his mind, he can't prove it's not an illusion. he can only, in his reasoning here, assume that he's a thinking thing. On the top of page 271, a few lines down, he says, thinking is another attribute. All right, well, he's going through all the different things that he can't identify with himself. So the bottom of page 270. The first mentioned were the powers of nutrition and walking, but if it be true that I am no body, it is true likewise that I am capable neither of walking nor of being nourished. Perception is another attribute of the soul, but perception too is impossible without the body. Besides, I have frequently during sleep believed that I perceive objects which I afterwards observed I did not in reality perceive. Thinking is another attribute of the soul, and here I discover what properly belongs to myself. This alone is inseparable from me. I am, I exist. This is certain, but how often? As often as I think. So he says, I am only a thinking thing. That's the only thing I can be certain that I am. And we'll compare that to what he said in the first reading we had by Descartes in part 1 of the book in a moment. So let me go to these discussion questions on page 277. Okay, discussion question 1. Explain the wax example from Meditation 1. Okay, so the wax example is actually in Meditation 2. So don't get confused about that. It is on page 272, the bottom paragraph. He's trying to show that all he is a thinking thing, and that his relationship with external objects is not really due to his sense perceptions. It's rather due to his understanding, what he calls his understanding. So every time he perceives something with his senses, what he's really doing is perceiving something with his mind, because already he's saying we can do away with the existence of a material body and all the 5 sense organs that are attached to it and still exist as a thinking thing. So this is what the wax example is supposed to show. So the bottom paragraph on page 272, he says, let us now accordingly consider the objects that are commonly thought to be the most easily and likewise the most distinctly known, the bodies we touch and see. Not indeed bodies in general, for these general notions are usually somewhat more confused, but one body in particular. Take, for example, this piece of wax. So he's sitting by the fire, he's holding a lump of wax. It is quite fresh, having been recently taken from the beehive. It has not yet lost the sweetness of the honey it contained. It still retains somewhat of the odor of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, figure, size are apparent to the sight. It is hard, cold, easily handled. The sound is when struck upon with the finger. Oh, and sound. So he whaps it with his finger. You can hear a sound. You can smell it. It's got a definite shape. In fine, all that contributes to make a body as distinctly known as possible is found in the one before us. But while I am speaking, let it be placed near the fire. What remained of the taste exhales, the smell evaporates, the color changes, its figure is destroyed, its size increases, it becomes liquid, it grows hot, it can hardly be handled, and although struck upon it emits no sound. Does the same wax still remain after this change? Then a sentence later he says, assuredly it could be nothing of all that I observed by means of the senses, since all the things that fell under taste, smell, sight, touch, and hearing are changed, and yet the same wax remains. So then he'll say a few lines down, there certainly remains nothing except something extended, flexible, and movable. So all of the former sense perceptions he had no longer apply to the wax. All that now applies to it is the concept of it being extended in space, flexible, and movable. But what is meant by flexible and movable? Is it not that I imagine that the piece of wax being round is capable of becoming square, or of passing from a square into a triangular figure? Assuredly, such is not the case, because I conceive that it admits of an infinity of similar changes, and I am, moreover, unable to compass this infinity by imagination. And consequently, this conception which I have of the wax is not the product of the faculty of imagination. So that's a trickier part of his argument here. He's saying you can imagine this malleable wax being transformed into an endless series of different shapes, and an infinity of similar changes. But the imagination cannot encompass, it cannot understand infinity, because the infinity is the opposite of definite. There's no border which you can wrap your mind around. So he's saying, therefore, if something has an infinite amount of variations, then that thing you're perceiving could not have arisen from your imagination. I don't know how strong that argument is, because he's going to differentiate imagination from understanding, which is a deeper faculty of the soul, and that's what he really is, he's going to say. So at any rate, if you're reading through this wax example, this is what he's trying to point out. So then he'll go on to say, but what now is this extension? Is it not also unknown? For it becomes greater when the wax is melted, greater when it is boiled, and greater still when the heat increases. And I should not conceive clearly and according to truth the wax as it is, if I did not suppose that the piece we are considering admitted even of a wider variety of extension than I ever imagined. I must therefore admit that I cannot even comprehend by imagination what the piece of wax is, and that it is the mind alone which perceives it. I speak of one piece in particular. Okay, so he's saying this wax, which formerly he identified with the 5 sense perceptions. You could taste the honey, smell the flowers, see its particular shape, hear it when you thwacked it. And so whatever the 5, taste it, all the 5 senses, when you put it right near the fire, all those sense perceptions change, and all that he was left with that was dependable was that he had something that's extended in space and it's flexible and movable. But then he says, but you could imagine it being extended through infinite space and taking on an infinite variety of shapes, so that really your imagination can't even comprehend what it is. So if your imagination can't comprehend it, then he'll say what's really understanding it is your understanding. Now, I don't know what the difference between understanding is and imagination. I mean, they both seem to be thinking, and thinking is his primary ingredient of the soul. I think, therefore I am. But I'll just continue here on page 273. He says, I must therefore admit that I cannot even comprehend by imagination what the piece of wax is, and that it is the mind alone which perceives it. I'm going to skip one sentence. But, and this is of moment to observe, the perception of it is neither an act of sight, of touch, nor of imagination, and never was either of these, though it might formally seem so, but is simply an intuition of the mind, which may be imperfect and confused, as it formerly was, or very clear and distinct, as it is at present, according as the attention is more or less directed to the elements which it contains, and of which it is composed. So the next paragraph, he talks about, using ordinary language when you say, oh, I see the wax. He's saying what you really mean is you understand that there's wax there, because what you're seeing isn't what it really is, for the reasons that we've been discussing. The last sentence on that bottom paragraph on 273, he says, we say, for example, that we see the same wax when it is before us, and not that we judge it to be the same from its retaining the same color and figure. Whence I should forthwith be disposed to conclude that the wax is known by the act of sight, and not by the intuition of the mind alone, were it not for the analogous instance of human beings passing on the street below as observed from a window. All right, so he's making another analogy. In this case, I do not fail to say that I see the men themselves, just as I say that I see the wax. And yet, what do I see from the window beyond hats and cloaks that might cover artificial machines whose motions might be determined by springs? But I judge that there are human beings from these appearances, and thus I comprehend by the faculty of judgment alone, which is in the mind, what I believed I saw with my eyes. So he's saying you can look down a window at people walking below in the street, and you say, oh, I see people. There they are. I can point to them as they walk. There goes this guy. But he's saying what you're really seeing is hats. If everyone's wearing a hat, you're seeing hats. Below the hat could be a robot, and they're just moving along, so that you interpret what you see through your senses, and then your mind fills in the information on what you're really perceiving. And so similarly, you see a piece of wax, well, what you're really doing is your mind is interpreting what this thing is. Because if you break that wax down to its constituent elements, as he showed before, you see this substance that can be extended and transformed in an infinite variety of ways. So your senses can never tell you what something really is. Only your mind, your understanding can tell you what something is. The bottom sentence on that next paragraph on page 274, he says, "But when I distinguish the wax from its exterior forms, and when, as if I had stripped it of its vestments, I consider it quite naked, it is certain, although some error may still be found in my judgment, that I cannot, nevertheless, thus apprehend it without possessing a human mind." The bottom paragraph there, he says, "But in conclusion," this is the last sentence on 274, "but in conclusion I find I have insensibly reverted to the point I desired, for, since it is now manifest to me that bodies themselves are not properly perceived by the senses, nor by the faculty of imagination, but by the intellect alone, and since they are not perceived because they are seen and touched, but only because they are understood or rightly comprehended by thought, I readily discover that there is nothing more easily or clearly apprehended than my own mind." So that is what the wax example is ultimately intended to prove. So what's real? That was the second fundamental question that we discussed in this book of 4 fundamental questions. This third fundamental question is, what can I know? And what Descartes is saying is, well, you can't know that the wax is real. It could be a dream. You could be dreaming it. It could be a hallucination created by some malignant demon. And even if it is something real, you're not knowing what it is through your sense perceptions. You're interpreting what it is in your mind. And your mind is a lot more reliable as a reality than what you perceive through your sense perceptions. So to the materialists who would say, I don't see a mind, so I can't touch it or hear it or taste it or smell it, but I can see this wax, so I believe in material objects, not in minds. Descartes will try to reverse that. He says, well, you should believe only in a mind and not in material objects. And so for that argument about the wax that we already went over, that's what it was ultimately trying to prove, that he exists as a thinking thing, and you can trust that you exist if you think. And so that's what a human is, a thinking being. We do not need to have a body. It can be a hallucination. We still exist as a thinking thing. So back to the discussion questions on page 277, discussion question 2. What are some ways around the I am, I exist argument? Explain. Okay. So here's one way I thought around the argument, is the Buddhist argument of no self, which is the same as David Hume's argument. So you think that you exist every time you think. Well, all right, I'll grant you this. A thought happened, and you can identify with that thought. But the next time you think, I am, I exist, it's not the same thought that it was the first time, and it's not the same self. There's no continuous self that's been thinking its way through your life that you can identify with. There's a series of unconnected thoughts. If you want to call each thought that's aware of itself a self, so that I am, I exist, okay. But again, the point is, every time you come to that conclusion, it's a different self coming to that conclusion. There is no continuous self. Another way around it is that Descartes talks about this malignant demon who can make him think anything that he wants. He's got infinite power of deception, and he's got his mind set on laying snares for his credulity. So if this malignant demon can make him think that 3 + 2 = 5, for example, when in fact it doesn't, then maybe this malignant demon can make him think that thinking proves you exist. So one of the examples Descartes gives is, I might doubt the existence of these physical things, but I can't doubt the truths of mathematics, for example. But this demon could make you think it. Every time you think 3 plus 2 equals 5, I mean, look, 3 fingers plus 1, 2 more, that's 5. I can see that, that's a fact. And then Descartes could say, yeah, you think that makes sense because there's some malignant demon making you think that. The laws of logic and mathematics are an illusion created by this demon. If that's the case, then the logical conclusion, I think, or therefore I am, or I am doubting, therefore I am, if you think that makes so much sense, maybe it's because some demon's just fooling you into thinking nonsense makes sense. So his own malignant demon argument can be used against itself, but still, that would imply the existence of some malignant demon. So then how would you do away with that evidence? So we're not going to keep going. We could probably take this on to infinity, but we're just going to move now to discussion question 3. Explain how the excerpt from the Meditations is connected to the excerpts in part 1 of 4 fundamental questions. So in part 1, way back, page 71 is where the Discourse on Method starts. So in the Discourse on Method, he had 2 basic arguments. The first one is that humans are rational beings and we have a soul. The soul he identifies with reason. If you don't have reason, you don't have a soul. Machines don't have reason, and neither do animals, he says, and therefore animals are just like machines, but they're made by God, so their machinery is a lot more sophisticated than the automata that humans can make. And his example was, a machine that looks like a human and could even talk, you could tell it's not a human by having a conversation with it. It wouldn't be able to adjust its conversation appropriately. It would just have a certain set of pre-programmed responses that you could eventually tell, oh, this is not a spontaneously thinking being. And the second one is that humans can go from one physical extreme to another, from the Arctic to the equator to space, because reason he calls a universal instrument which can serve for all contingencies. So some animals can live better in the water, like fish. Some can live better in the air, like birds, but only humans can live underwater or in the air. No other creatures can, so we have this. That proves we have reason, and therefore we have a soul. That was the first argument that we read. And then the second one was his belief that the soul interacts with the body in the pineal gland, which is the one part of the brain, he says, that's not double. You have a left and a right hemisphere in your brain, like there's a mirror symmetry, but right in the middle there's this one gland that doesn't have a double, so it's probably where all the input from the left and right sides of your body, from your left and right eye, left and right ear, they all get unified in that pineal gland where the soul is. And then there's these animal spirits that carry the information from the senses through the nerves to the soul in the pineal gland, and then the soul sends its instructions out from the pineal gland through the same animal spirits which subtly move through the nerves to your body. That was his theory, in part, in the first reading by Descartes. So in Meditations, he's rejecting everything he formerly accepted. And specifically, he says that he is not, on page 270, in the middle of the page, he says, it further occurred to me that I was nourished. He's talking about what he formerly believed, that I walked, perceived, and thought, and all those actions I referred to the soul. But what the soul itself was, I either did not say to consider, or if I did, I imagined that it was something extremely rare and subtle, like wind or flame or ether, spread throughout my grosser parts. As regarded the body, I did not even doubt of its nature, but thought I distinctly knew it. It fills a certain space, for example. So then later he'll say, all right, now I doubt there's even a body, I doubt there's even space, and I can't say that the soul spreads out like some kind of an ether through the body, because I'm doubting that I even have a body. Over on page 271, about a third of the way down the page, he says, now it is plain I am not the assemblage of members called the human body. I am not a thin and penetrating air diffused through all these members, or wind, or flame, or vapor, or breath, or any of all the things I can imagine, for I supposed that all these were not, and without changing the supposition, I find that I still feel assured of my existence. All right, so just comparing a little bit what he said in the first readings we had and what he's saying here. One point that he maintains is that the self is a thinking being, and furthermore, it's a rational being, because he's reasoning from the fact that I'm doubting everything else. I can reason that I exist as a doubting being. If I doubt, I must think. If I'm thinking, I'm doing something. If I'm doing anything, I must exist. So it's really like in this meditations, he's less of a dualist, because now he doesn't even believe that there's necessarily a body. All that he can be sure of that really exists is his own thought. So discussion question 4 on page 277. Compare how Descartes answers the question, how do I know if I am dreaming, to the way Chuang Tzu answers. Okay, so Chuang Tzu's, the writings of Chuang Tzu. The last paragraph was the butterfly example, where formerly I, this is on page 261, the last paragraph, formerly I, Quang Cow, dreamt that I was a butterfly flying about. Feeling that it was enjoying itself, I did not know that it was cow. Suddenly I awoke and was myself again, the veritable cow. I did not know whether it had formerly been cow dreaming that he was a butterfly, or it was now a butterfly dreaming that it was cow. So how can you tell? A page earlier, on page 260, right across the page, after saying, how do I know that the dead do not repent of their former craving for life? How do you know that being dead isn't even better? Then he'll go on to say, those who dream of the pleasure of drinking may in the morning wail and weep. Those who dream of wailing and weeping may in the morning be going out to hunt. When they were dreaming, they did not know it was a dream. In their dream, they may even have tried to interpret it, but when they awoke, they knew that it was a dream. And there is the great awaking, after which we shall know that this life was a great dream. So that, if you're going to compare, that's what you're comparing Descartes to. Descartes says, not necessarily that we live in a great dream and that we can all wake up, like Plato said, we live in a cave of shadows and we can come out of the cave. What Descartes says is fine. Let's just assume that I'm living in a dream. And then he uses that as proof that he still exists as a thinking thing. He was looking for one point of firm truth to believe in, and he uses the possibility that we're dreaming. He says it's impossible to tell whether you're dreaming or not. There's no way to prove that you're not in a dream right now, because we've all fooled ourselves into thinking that we were really in a waking world when we've been asleep. So there's no absolutely trustworthy way to prove that you're not always dreaming. And Descartes will say, I'll grant you that we are always dreaming. Still, I exist because I think. I exist because I'm being deceived into thinking my dream is reality. If I'm deceived, I must be real. Even if nothing else is, I can know that I exist as a thinking thing. Okay, so that will be it for Descartes. We're going to skip John Locke's essay, an essay concerning human understanding, mainly because it would just be an overload of reading, and also because the reading after him by George Berkeley summarizes Locke's basic points and then responds to them in his own way. So the next video will be about George Berkeley's his essay, A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge. And what he'll say is all that you really see in the world around you are ideas in your mind, kind of like what Descartes was saying. And that's all that really exists. Why do you assume there's something outside of your mind? You could never prove it if there really was, and it's an added, unnecessary addition to your experience of reality. What's real? Minds and the ideas that they think. That's what George Berkeley will say.